We are studying the history of Moses and the giving of the law and the various instructions and things that had been given to him that he passes down to the people and the difficulties that they encountered from time to time as it relates to receiving that law. And so we're continuing um, to discuss this, and we're going to be in lesson 10 in your lesson sheets in just a little while. I want to go back, though, before I jump into lesson 10. I want to go back. I had a question that I really actually still can't answer with any kind of real clarity, but I think I can at least take a stab at it to help. But we had a question towards the end of our study on Wednesday about, do we know how many times or if and when the ark ever got reopened, or did they ever do that? And it's kind of a tricky question in the sense that we learn about when items were going to be put in it at different timetables. And so if those events, in other words, if at one moment he's told to put the covenant in there, and the next moment he's told to put Aaron's rod in there, and the next moment he's told to put this in there, and those didn't happen simultaneously, then obviously what? They had to reopen it in order to do that. And so I would argue that line of thinking, that it was opened more than once. I don't know that we have an instantaneous moment where every single item that was going in would go in simultaneously. And so I think you probably have, from a historical background, moments where something new was added, and so you would have that situation. It's interesting, and I'll pause here in a minute, and if you've got more to add to that. But I want you to go to Hebrews chapter 9 for a minute. Here, this was what's kind of interesting about it to me, is in some ways the clearest statement made about what's in it is what the Hebrew writer said in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 4. Notice that as he recounts this history, he said, which had the golden censer and the ark of the covenant overlaid round about with gold. We learned about that in our study. Wherein, in other words, wherein was inside the ark of the covenant was the golden pot that had manna, right? I think that's number 17. I think I'd have to go back in my mind again a little bit to see where they talk about that historical reminder of how he fed them for 40 years. And so you've got the pot of manna. You've got Aaron's rod. That what, by the way? That budded. If you recall, there's a piece of history where Moses has them bring the rod. When they come back, Aaron's is budding. And so that's told to be put. And again, it's tricky because sometimes you'll hear words like, put it beside the ark. And you're trying to figure out, does beside mean in, or does it mean in front of? What does that mean, depending on how you're viewing that? And again, that's why I believe Hebrews 9:4 kind of gives us maybe the clearest picture, that these were the items that they understood were in the ark. So you've got the pot of manna, Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. Now, some ask me, the secondary question that was asked about that was, are we talking about the new completed version after Moses goes back up the second time, or were the broken pieces of the tables of stone that he broke, were they in there as well? And again, I don't know that we've got a real clear picture of that. Deuteronomy 31, if you looked at Deuteronomy 31 for a minute with me, Deuteronomy 31 is that moment when Moses is kind of giving some instructions, last instructions, if you will, to the people. It's the moment where Joshua is selected and said, you're going to be the new leader that's going to lead them actually into the promised land, because Moses isn't going. So there's instructions as it relates to that. But later in the chapter, as Moses is kind of giving these concerns, but notice he said, speaking of God, my anger shall be kindled against them in that day. I will forsake them. I will hide my face from them. And many evils and troubles shall befall them, so that they will say in that day, are not these evils come upon us because our God is not among us? There's going to be that challenge when he leaves them. I will surely hide my face in that day, for all the evils which they shall have wrought in that, they are turned unto other gods. Therefore write this song for you, and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. For when I shall have brought them into the land which I swore to their fathers, that floweth with milk and honey, and they shall have eaten and filled themselves and waxen fat, then will they turn unto other gods, and serve them, and provoke me, and break my covenant. And so if you continue, this is a very condemning kind of a future telling of, I'm still going to give you the land that flows with milk and honey. I'm still going to let you conquest the promised land. I'm going to give all that to you. But I'm telling you ahead of time, when you get there, this is what I'm going to get in thanks for it. What you're going to do is when you get fat and you get comfortable and everything's going great and things are well with you, you're going to turn back to idolatry, which is kind of a segue in here in a few moments to what we're going to talk about this morning in Lesson 10. But God's kind of telling them ahead of time concerning those things. And then it says, and it came to pass when Moses had made an end of writing the words of this law in a book, until they were finished, that Moses commanded the Levites which bear the ark of the covenant of the Lord, saying, take this book of the law and put it in the side of the ark. And again, interesting wording there, but in the side of the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, that it may be there for a witness against thee. There are some who argue that he wrote that on these are the broken ones, that these are the broken tablets. The problem with that is it doesn't seem like that can fit, because he wrote those, God wrote those up on the mountain. He brings them down and breaks them. God says, get 2 new stones, go back up and get the law again. This almost seems to be something else that Moses is writing down. More instructions, more information. Write that down and put that in there too. And so I don't know. This was the only narrative that anybody pointed to. And I think it's the imagery is why they do that. Because he's talking about how they're going to break the covenant. And what have you got with those original 2 tablets? You've got them broken. And so I get why some might get that imagery that maybe this is, I just couldn't get that myself. I couldn't draw that conclusion out of what's happening here in this text. At least nothing that I saw jumped out at me as it relates to that. And so it's difficult. We don't have a lot of, if you would, a single moment in time where we get a better picture than what Hebrews 9:4 illustrates to us, where this is what God wanted them to put in the Ark of the Covenant. And the problem too is because you've got historical backdrop of Exodus, and then you've got the book of Deuteronomy that kind of overlaps in some ways as it relates to what's happening between Moses and the people. And so it can become challenging. We do know this. After the Babylonian captivity, when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys Jerusalem, you don't see it again. That seems to be the moment in historical timetable where it doesn't get seen again, or really even referenced to my knowledge, after the Babylonian captivity. So when Nebuchadnezzar comes down and destroys Jerusalem, it's gone. They talk about it, conversation about it. You don't see it resurface. You see it before that, and instructions about how it was carried before them when they crossed Jordan. It's there with them in battle at times. It's eventually ends up in Solomon's temple that he constructs as God would have them to. You see that scene with David and Uzzah and those kinds of things. But after the Babylonian captivity, it's just nowhere as it relates to the historical backdrop. There are those secular historians that come along and claim that there was a group of individuals, and that's why all the movies and the speculation and the conversations occur, because there are those who argue that there was a group of people that wanted it preserved, got it out of Jerusalem before Nebuchadnezzar was able to conquest over Jerusalem and destroy it, went and hid it somewhere, and secret societies have been protecting it ever since. There's no biblical validation of any sort that would imply, suggest, or have that narrative being accurate. It's for great storytelling, um, but not necessarily is biblically accurate storytelling, because it just doesn't anymore after the Babylonian captivity. So that's the best I could do in terms of as it relates. I think Hebrews 9:4 is pretty clear about at least his description about what was in it. And then there are other narratives in the Old Testament times, various points in times where instructions are given as it relates to the ark. Go ahead, Bob. I'll come back to you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If it did, it did. Yeah, yeah. Any other thoughts or questions? Go ahead. Go ahead. There were certainly, by the time you get further into history, it's obvious that there were other documentations, not just the tablets of stone that originated in the days of Moses. There had been copies of some sort or kind made, because you're right, when they come back in and we're cleaning house, and oh wow, there's our law. We kind of forgot about that, and they work towards some of the kings even work towards restoring that commitment. Brian, do you have a thought? I'm sorry, I walked away. Yeah, yeah. When John, yeah, when it's the last reference to the ark, um, in terms of acknowledging, and John acknowledges that there's within this vision that he sees in Revelation 11, he sees the ark of the covenant um, within the heavenly realm of God. I suppose we could, it's kind of hard for us to make this connection sometimes of physical, because that was a physical ark, and but God can do anything. He could have translated that physical ark, and that could be where it went. But again, that it's hard to know exactly. But there is definitely a reference that John makes in his vision of heaven that he sees it there. Yeah, yeah. The Dome of the Rock. Yeah, yeah. And so you would have some interesting history. And I think there's a reason. I think that um, after that Babylonian captivity, and they come back, that 70-year captivity, they're able to come back. That at least southern tribes, and they come back as it relates to God's promises, but they're never what they once were. Um, Again, and you kind of start seeing the transitional time period in which eventually Jesus is going to arrive, and all of these things that were meant to be the predecessors and the things that were leading up to that will have been fulfilled. Yeah, yeah. What's that? Yeah, yeah. But and again, all that and we could wonder, right? We could do that all day with it. And right. And the key to that whole thing is, I just think they thought, for convenience sake, let's put it on a cart and take it to Jerusalem. It'll be easier that way than to have a priest that would carry it. I think they did what human beings do. We convince ourselves that surely this will be okay. Even though that wasn't the instructions, that wasn't what God had commanded. We convince ourselves, well, this surely He'll understand. We've got this trek to make, and we want to move it, and we want to get it there, and we rationalize away commitment to the instructions of God. Okay, jump into lesson 10 then. I did want to come back to that because I thought that was interesting, and I wish I researched that, and every time I would look, and I had some things I was going to share with you, and I thought, no, some of that's not even right. And so I couldn't, it was hard. It was hard to get much clarity to that. Open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 12. And if you have your lesson sheets, we're in the very beginning of lesson 10. So God wants to make sure the people have a law to govern them, to lead them, and to guide them once they've conquested the promised land, and behaviors and choices that they needed to follow. And it's interesting that one of those primary, if you will, focuses is don't go back into idolatry. If you go back into idolatry, there's going to be complications, challenges, difficulties. You're going to bring harm to yourself. And it's interesting that the very thing that seems to be of utmost importance to God is the very first thing that they go back. They begin to incorporate when they begin to get and everything's going great. And so they head back into idolatry. And then once they do that, then all the other instructions and laws that God gave, they begin to fall apart as well. When you're willing to abandon God in that reality and begin to follow in the idolatry and worshiping of other gods, then it would be natural to follow that you begin to also break and breach many other of His instructions, because you've already abandoned the authority that He once had in the covenant that He made over you. And so He boldly wants them to understand the importance of this. These are the statutes, verse 1 of Deuteronomy 12. These are the statutes and judgments which ye shall observe to do in the land, which the Lord God of thy fathers giveth thee to possess it all the days that ye live upon the earth. Ye shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods, upon the high mountains and upon the hills and under every green tree. The key to that is not just a violent, destructive mindset. You shall utterly destroy all the places wherein the nations which ye shall possess serve their gods, upon the high mountains and upon the hills and under every green tree. If you don't, what's going to happen? Yeah, if you go in and just try to assimilate into that environment, then the next thing you know, you're going to be following the gods of that land rather than the God of heaven. And so you need to overthrow their altars. You need to break their pillars. You need to burn their groves with fire. You shall hew down the graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them out of that place. Tear everything down that's referencing another god, and don't store it somewhere, right? Don't tear it down and put it in some storage facility or stack it somewhere. Get rid of it. It's got to go, because you don't want the temptation to want to go into that kind of mindset. You shall not do so unto the Lord your God, but unto the place which the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes to put His name there, even unto His habitation shall ye seek, and thither shall you come. And thither you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, and heave offerings of your hand, and your vows, and your freewill offerings, and the firstlings of your herds and of your flocks. And there ye shall eat before the Lord your God, and ye shall rejoice in all that He put your hand unto you and your households, wherein the Lord thy God hath blessed thee. So, go in and destroy all of their idolatry. Go in and tear down all of those altars. And then God's going to assign what? A place for you to come. Don't go in there and say, "Wow, what a tremendous structure! This would be a great place for us to worship God." It just happens to be a bunch of other idols and statues around that. But look how great it is. Be a perfect setting for us to work. God says, "Don't do that." You go in and get rid of all those references to other gods. Get rid of all those altars and places of worship. I'll assign you a place where you can come and bring your sacrifices and bring your worship before me and bring those things. Don't go in there and just start thinking, well, this would just work perfect. God doesn't want it. You shall not do after all the things that we do here this day. Every man whatsoever is right in his own eyes. They're lawless in the sense that they're not being governed very well yet. The chaos, if you will, the lack of consistency in behavior is because they have yet to cohesively bind themselves under a law, because the law was still being what? Still being delivered. Okay, it's still being taught, and they're still being educated about it. And so they're in the infancy of this relationship with God and this law that He's giving them. And basically Moses says, right now we're doing what? Whatever we want to do, right? Every man is doing whatever he wants to do. No one is governing themselves by any consistent law. Every man is doing what's right in his own. Sound familiar? Yeah. You see it, you historically, you see that behavior happen, and even in modern culture, you see the same philosophy. Right and wrong today is subject to only what? Whatever you think. That's not the written law of the land. That's the written cultural behavior of the land. We and I don't want to overstate the case here. Men have been that way for ever. Yeah. And so men have been elevating themselves like gods and elevating themselves in terms of their own awareness and their own desire of labeling what's right and wrong and true and not true and good and evil. And that process hasn't changed. And that happens because men are reluctant to govern themselves by the testimony of who? The Creator. They're going to have a problem with it. We have a problem with it. Everybody over the history has been challenged by the commitment necessary to be governed by the instructions of God and let that rule in their lives. And so you see His instructions about avoiding idolatry to the extreme of saying, make sure you get rid of all of it. When you go over Jordan in verse 10, and dwell in the land which the Lord your God giveth you to inherit, and when He giveth you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you dwell in safety, everything's great, then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose to cause His name to dwell there. Thither shall you bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, your heave offerings of your hand, your choice vows, which you vow unto the Lord. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, ye and your sons, your daughters, your men servants, your maid servants, and the Levite that is within your gates, for as much as he hath no part nor inheritance with you. And so that's talking about the Levites and their relationship to the people. Take heed to thyself, that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest. Remember, and again, let's think historically about these are the instructions God intends to govern them until who arrives? Till Jesus arrives. And so this is the way God wanted them to behave until Jesus arrives. And that new covenant of promise is put in place. And it's interesting that He says to them, take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest, when eventually we hit the divided kingdom period. What's the first thing they did? Yeah, we if I'm in the 10 northern tribes, right, and I'm part of that divided kingdom, and I don't want anything to do with the southern, the problem is, where's Jerusalem? It lies within Judah, right? If I'm not mistaken, it's in, and I divided away from Judah. I don't want, so we go and we put what? Altars in Dan and Bethel, right? We built places of worship, one far to the north, one far to the south, in terms of those 10 tribes. And don't go to Jerusalem anymore. Go to Dan or Bethel if you want to worship God. The very thing that God explicitly said here, don't do. They do. And it's no wonder then that idolatry becomes rampant. When they vacate the very basic instructions and rules governing how, when, where to worship, they begin to create difficulties for themselves because of that. But in the place which the Lord shall choose, in one of thy tribes, there shalt offer thy burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I command thee. That becomes Jerusalem in Judah, where the temple eventually will be built. Thoughts or questions about that piece? Jump down with me into verse 29 for a moment. And just get a handful of a little bigger picture. So when the Lord thy God shall cut off the nations from before thee, whither thou goest to possess them, and thou succeedest them, and dwellest in their land, take heed to thyself that thou be not snared by following them, after that they be destroyed from before thee, and that thou inquire not after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? Even so will I do likewise. There's an old phrase about cats. It's curiosity what? Curiosity killed the cat. They say, Brian, what in the world's that got to do with what we're saying? Curiosity is a challenge sometimes. We can play the what if game to such an extreme that the next thing we know, the what if becomes more important than what we actually know about something. God says, don't go in there. We're going to move them all out, and then you're going to see these statues and these altars and these temples and all these things, and you're going to go, wonder what they did in there. Wonder what this God was about. And you're going to start asking questions, and you're going to start getting curious, and the next thing you know, you're going to start being influenced by that. And so be careful. I think there's legitimate pursuit of wanting to understand and know more of what God has actually taught, instructed, and shared with us. That's legitimate. There should be, I would hope, within every believer, a curiosity, if you will, that says, I want to know as much as I can about God and His will and His purposes and what He's delivered within the message of the Bible. And so that's an honest curiosity of what God has actually said. But be careful that our curiosities don't actually take us away from wanting to know more about God and to know more about gods. Yeah. And next thing you know, you're going to adopt those principles and you're going to say, well, those seem to be somewhat cohesive. Let's add to what God has said. And that again becomes a problem for them and everybody from that point. Thou shalt not do so unto the Lord thy God. It's an interesting statement, isn't it? Think about it. You think, well, who's harmed by this? Well, God says, I'm harmed by it. If that's the path you take, I'm harmed by it. Don't do that to me. Don't do that to me. And think about it. If you become curious about all these idols and these other gods and all that, what's that basically saying to Jehovah? Yeah, you're not good enough. Or I'm dissatisfied. I'm dissatisfied with what you've offered. I don't like everything about the way you've governed us or you've instructed us. I think there's something to be learned by these other idols or these other gods. And the next thing you know, you've got this challenge. He said, don't do that to me. For every abomination to the Lord which He hateth have they done unto their gods. For even their sons and their daughters they have burnt in the fire to their gods. Light bulb, right? Again, this isn't just about God being violent or God wanting to get rid of people. This is about recognizing the abominations that were going on among these idolatrous worshipers. They were sacrificing what? Their own children. Okay? They're sacrificing their own children in idolatrous worship. And God says, these things are an abomination to me. That's why I want you to go out and just move it out of there. Don't go in and try to assimilate it. Go move it out of there. Because these things are an abomination to me. What things soever I command you, observe to do it. Thou shalt not add, there's that phrase, thou shalt not add thereto, nor diminish from it. Don't add to it, don't take away from it, just go fulfill it. Because the abominations that are going on in that place are horrendous. The behaviors that go along with the idolatry. So, number one, it's an insult that you would turn to something other than Jehovah God. Number two, the behaviors and the type of worship that goes along with that idolatry is deplorable. It's horrible. And so it's time for that place that was really the place determined to be the land for God's people to be cleansed. And so that was the instructions that they were given in chapter 12. 3 questions were asked if you go back to your lesson sheets for a moment. He said, who will choose where God shall be worshipped in Canaan? God will. God will choose. And he said, I'm going to pick a place within one tribe. I'm going to pick a place in which you can go and worship. Were all the laws of God fully in place before entrance into Canaan? You know, there are instructions, guidelines, further information that will eventually and ultimately come. What kind of practices are involved in idolatrous worship? We just talked about them. Yeah, there's immorality, but there's these abominations, including what they were doing with their own children as it relates to it. Anything further about the idolatry and the warnings concerning it? Well, here's another level of challenge as it relates to idolatrous worship, and that was the sexual immorality that tended to go along with those behaviors. In contrast, notice the paragraph, in contrast to idolatry, the law of Moses set a high standard of sexual conduct. Adultery is forbidden under penalty of death. Prostitution, incest, homosexuality, and bestiality are also all of them prohibited by the instructions and laws of God. In fact, Leviticus has several narratives in chapter 18 and 20 where he warns the Israelites against defiling themselves with the abominable practice of the Egyptians and the Canaanites. These behaviors, by the way, and you could see it repeated, by the way, in the New Testament as well, but the reason why these sins and practices are condemned heavily by Jehovah is they involve the temple that God gave our souls to reside in. Our temples were meant to be honorable. Our temples were meant to be used in honorable ways because we were created in what? In the image of God. And so the adultery and all these sinful behaviors that are listed here, they are all sins against yourself. And the very temple, the very body in which God has given us. And so we have to recognize the consequences of these behaviors, and they tended to go hand in hand with the idolatry that was going on among these pagan worshipers. And so again, a need by which for them to recognize the difficulties they could create for themselves. What practice does Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13 prohibit? Yeah. And again, and by the way, it's not just an Old Testament narrative, right? The difficulty of that sin is repeated, and the challenges that it presents is also within the New Covenant as well. And in our culture, to speak against certain things almost immediately can become labeled as hate. there's no hate or malice in simply stating that God has stated repeatedly that the behavior of homosexuality is an abomination to Him. Now, you have every right as a citizen of the United States to ignore what God says. Now trust me, that's to your consequence and condemnation later when you stand before God. But in this country, you are not obligated to follow New Covenant or Old Testament law. You have rights and choices and decisions to make, and I have repeatedly said I need those as much as everybody else does. I need that liberty to be able to say what I'm saying right now. I need that liberty and freedom of choice to be able to speak what I believe is truthful and honest as it relates to what God has taught and said. It is not about hating someone. I have no right to hate anybody, even according to God's will. I have no right to be malicious or evil or hateful towards anyone. God would condemn me if that were the practice. But God's narrative is clear about what behaviors and choices that man can make that are an abomination to Him. Homosexuality is just one, by the way. It's one of many things. Idolatry is an abomination before God. It's one of many things. It doesn't take. It's not on a priority list. Okay, it's not necessarily any more or less condemning than anything else that God has said is an abomination before Him. But if we want to be right with God according to these narratives, and I'm trying not according to Brian, doesn't matter what Brian says, but according to Leviticus 18, according to what Paul wrote to those in Corinth, according to what instructions are given in Matthew 19, for example, there's plenty of testimony within Scripture to illustrate what God says is sinful. If I disagree with God, in America, you've got a liberty and right to do that. And make choices however you want to live from a civil liberties and a civil law standpoint. But you can't take a magic marker and start writing or drawing through these narratives within the Bible. And I couldn't change them if I wanted to. I would endanger you and myself if I did. And so they're there. God has spoken very clearly about these things. And I would encourage anybody who wants to be right with God, if that's your priority, if that's the choice you're striving to make in life, then listen to what God actually says about the subject and honor it and respect it. Because He's pretty clear about what He approves of and disapproves of. And by the way, He's just as condemning of heterosexual fornication, for lack of a better phrase, as He is about homosexuality. Okay? I'd never be accused of hate speech, by the way, saying that. Right? I'd never be accused of hate speech by saying God despises heterosexual fornication. But He does just as vehemently as He does homosexuality or bestiality or any of these other things that He lists in those texts. God is just as condemning about all of them, and that's the truth of Scripture. And we couldn't change that narrative and be right with God at the end of the day. And so let's just appreciate the legitimate truth of what God has actually said, and then make a choice. Make a decision. Do I want to honor God or not? Do I want to honor that text or not? Do I want to follow God's laws or not? Because that's what He said, and you can't change it. And I can't change it. All right, Lord willing, we'll come back to this lesson Wednesday evening.